You have probably heard the story about the razor blades sewn into the peaks of the caps, the detail that gave the Peaky Blinders their name, the image that the television series made iconic, the suggestion that these were men so ruthless and so inventive that they weaponized their own clothing. It is a compelling story. It is almost certainly not true. The historical evidence for razor blades and caps is thin to non-existent, and the men who actually comprised the Peaky Blinders gang in late 19th century Birmingham were considerably less cinematic than the version that has embedded itself in popular culture. They were street-level criminals from the industrial slums of Small Heath and Bordesley, violent, territorial, and operating at the scale that poverty and opportunity allowed, which was not a large scale. But here's what is true, and what is far more interesting than any story about razor blades. The Peaky Blinders, and every organized criminal network that followed them across the next century and a half, were running a business, not a metaphorical business, a literal one, with revenue streams, cost structures, territorial monopolies, enforcement mechanisms, and, eventually, sophisticated financial architecture designed to convert illegal income into legitimate wealth. The progression from street gang to financial empire is not a unique story belonging to one city or one era. It is one of the most consistent patterns in modern economic history, and it teaches something about the nature of capitalism itself that the standard financial curriculum is not designed to deliver. The question worth asking is not why criminal organizations act like businesses. The question is why so many businesses, when examined closely enough, are difficult to distinguish from criminal organizations. That distinction, between what is called crime and what is called commerce, has always been, to a significant degree, a question of who writes the law and who benefits from its application. Welcome to Hidden Ledger, where we open the books that were never meant to be public. If you want to understand how power actually works, not the version in the textbook, but the version in the ledger, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every video we publish is another page of the ledger, the hidden one. The real Peaky Blinders emerged in Birmingham in the 1890s, at the intersection of industrial poverty, mass urbanization, and a police force that was structurally underpowered relative to the density of the population it was supposed to control. They were young men, most of them teenagers and early 20s, from the streets around the manufacturing districts of the city. Their income came from street robbery, protection rackets applied to local businesses and street traders, and the control of gambling, specifically the illegal betting that operated around Birmingham's racecourses and in the back rooms of public houses. This is territorial monopoly, and it is the foundational business model of every organized criminal enterprise, from Victorian Birmingham to 21st century drug trafficking networks. The product being sold is the absence of violence, and the seller is also the source of the threat. The margin on that product, when the monopoly holds, is extraordinary. By the 1900s and into the 1920s, the Birmingham gangs, the Peaky Blinders and their successors, had extended their operations more formally into racecourse protection, where they competed and sometimes violently clashed with London-based gangs for control of the bookmaking operations that accompanied horse racing across the English Midlands. This is the period the television series focuses on most closely, and the broad outlines of the gang warfare it depicts are historically grounded, even if the specific characters and many of the storylines are invented. But the more important development of this period is not the violence. It is what the violence was protecting. The Peaky Blinders, like every street gang that achieves a degree of longevity, were not primarily a violence operation. Violence was the enforcement mechanism, the tool used to establish and maintain the territorial monopoly that made the financial operation possible. The financial operation was the point. And as the 1920s progressed and more sophisticated criminal networks moved into the same territory, most notably the Sabini gang from London, which brought a level of organizational and financial sophistication that the Birmingham street gangs could not match, the original Peaky Blinders faded. By the 1930s, they were largely a historical memory, replaced by networks that had understood something they had not, that violence builds the foundation, but finance builds the empire. The American case study in this evolution is more thoroughly documented and more dramatic in its scale, and it illustrates the progression from street-level operation to sophisticated financial architecture, with a clarity that the Birmingham case cannot quite match. Al Capone's operation in Chicago during Prohibition was, at its peak in the late 1920s, generating estimated revenues of approximately $100 million per year, roughly equivalent to $1.8 billion in today's money. The source of that revenue was the supply of illegal alcohol to a market of millions of consumers whose demand had not diminished simply because the government had made the product illegal. Prohibition did not eliminate the alcohol market. It transferred control of it from licensed businesses, subject to taxation and regulation, to criminal networks subject to neither, and it simultaneously eliminated the legal competition. From a purely structural perspective, Prohibition was one of the most generous regulatory gifts ever delivered to organized crime. What made Capone's operation notable was not the violence, though the violence was real and extensive, but the organizational sophistication he brought to what had previously been a fragmented and chaotic market. He understood vertical integration, The principle that controlling every stage of a supply chain, from production through distribution to retail, maximizes margin and minimizes dependency on external suppliers who can be unreliable, overpriced, or compromised. Capone's operation controlled its own breweries, its own distribution network, and its own retail outlets in the form of the speakeasies that operated under his protection. He was, in the language of modern business school, a vertically integrated conglomerate operating in an unregulated market with extraordinarily high margins and enforcement capacity that no legitimate competitor could replicate. The limitation of Capone's model was also its most visible feature. He treated the financial architecture of his operation as secondary to its operational management. He was eventually convicted not of murder, not of bootlegging, not of any of the violence that his organization had produced across more than a decade, but of tax evasion. He had not built the legitimate financial infrastructure to absorb, clean, and reinvest his revenues at sufficient scale. The money was real. The paper trail that should have normalized it was absent. That absence was the vulnerability that the state eventually exploited. The lesson his successors drew from it was precise. The problem was not the crime. The problem was the accounting. Before moving to the modern iterations of this evolution, it is worth pausing on a concept that the standard financial vocabulary does not have an adequate term for, but which is central to understanding how criminal organizations accumulate and exercise power. Fear is a form of capital. This is not a metaphor. In the same way that financial capital generates returns by being deployed into productive activities, fear generates returns by being deployed into compliance. A business that pays protection money to an organized crime network is not paying for a service in any conventional sense. It is paying to avoid a cost, the cost of the violence or disruption that non-payment would produce. The criminal organization is monetizing a threat that it controls. And the remarkable thing about fear as a capital asset is that once established, it generates returns with relatively low ongoing investment. You do not need to commit violence every week to maintain the compliance of a business that paid protection money last month. The credible threat of violence, reliably established, operates as a standing asset that earns continuously. This dynamic is not exclusive to criminal organizations. Anyone who has studied speculative financial bubbles will recognize a version of the same mechanism. The fear of missing out, of watching others accumulate returns while you remain on the sideline, is the force that drives capital into overvalued assets at precisely the wrong moment. The financial institution that is too big to fail is extracting value from the implicit threat of systemic collapse, in the same way that a protection racket extracts value from the threat of physical destruction. The mechanism is different. The structure is identical. Whoever controls the source of the fear controls the flow of the capital. That insight did not originate in business school. It originated in the back streets of industrial Birmingham and the speakeasies of Prohibition-era Chicago, and it has been applied at progressively larger scales ever since. The Japanese Yakuza represent perhaps the most complete historical example of a criminal organization successfully navigating the transition from street-level enforcement to financial legitimacy, and then, uniquely, making that transition partially visible rather than concealing it. At their peak in the early 1990s, the major Yakuza syndicates operated openly. They had offices with nameplates. They had business cards, they had publicists. The largest syndicate, the Yamaguchi Gumi, published an internal newsletter. This was not recklessness. It was a strategic expression of the Yakuza's particular position in Japanese society. As quasi-legitimate organizations that perform social functions, the state either could not or chose not to perform, including debt collection, dispute resolution, and the management of construction and entertainment industries, where the line between the formal and informal economy had always been deliberately blurred. The Yakuza had, over decades, made themselves structurally useful to enough legitimate economic actors that their elimination would have caused genuine disruption to industries that preferred not to examine too closely where their contracts came from. The Latin American cartels represent the same evolutionary logic applied to a different product and a different political context, and they illustrate most clearly the multinational corporation phase of criminal capitalism. The major cartels of the late 20th and early 21st centuries are not, in their financial architecture, fundamentally different from global commodity trading companies. They source a product in one jurisdiction, process it in a second, transport it through multiple third countries using logistics networks of considerable sophistication, and retail it in consumer markets thousands of miles from the point of production. They manage currency exposure across multiple countries, maintain banking relationships, some of them with institutions that have paid enormous fines for facilitating exactly this, and to run parallel legitimate business operations that serve as vehicles for financial integration. The violence is real and it is horrific. It is also, from the perspective of the financial structure, a cost of enforcement in markets where no legal mechanism for contract enforcement exists. The distinction between criminal organization and legitimate corporation has always been less stable than the language used to describe it suggests. It is, at its core, a legal distinction, and law is not a natural phenomenon. It is a political construction, written by people with interests, enforced selectively, and revised when the balance of interests shifts sufficiently. The robber barons of 19th century American capitalism, the railroad monopolists, the oil trust operators, the steel magnates, built their fortunes through methods that included bribery, market manipulation, violent suppression of labor, and the systematic destruction of competitors through means that were, at the time, either legal or simply not yet illegal because the regulatory framework that would eventually constrain them had not yet been written. Standard Oil's monopoly practices, J.P. Morgan's market corners, the railroad company's land seizures, these were not crimes in most of the jurisdictions where they occurred. They were business. The law was written around them, not before them. When the law eventually caught up, in the form of antitrust legislation and financial regulation, the fortunes had already been made, and the families that held them had already begun the process of converting economic power into political influence and social legitimacy that would insulate those fortunes from the regulatory environment that followed. The Peaky Blinders were doing at the scale that poverty and geography permitted, something structurally similar to what the most celebrated industrialists of their era were doing at national scale. The difference was not the method. The difference was the scale, the legal environment, and the access to the political process that determined which activities would be classified as commerce and which would be classified as crime. Real wealth has always been about control. Control of capital, control of the mechanisms that generate it, and above all, control of the legitimacy that determines whether those mechanisms are called enterprise or extortion. The Peaky Blinders faded because they never made the transition from violence to finance. They understood the enforcement mechanism, but not the accumulation architecture. The organizations that succeeded them in Birmingham, in Chicago, in Tokyo, in Medellin understood that the violence was always in service of something else, and that something else was the control of a revenue stream, the laundering of its proceeds into legitimate assets, and the gradual conversion of economic power into the kind of social and political legitimacy that makes the original source of the wealth progressively harder to examine. This is the lesson that the history of organized crime delivers to anyone willing to read it as a financial document rather than a crime story. The question of whether a given accumulation of wealth is legitimate is almost always a question about when you're asking it. The generation that builds the fortune uses methods that the generation that inherits it prefers not to examine closely. The generation that manages the endowment funds the universities and the hospitals and the think tanks that shape the regulatory environment in which the next generation of wealth will be built. The cycle is not hidden. It is the most consistently documented pattern in the financial history of the modern world. Real wealth is about control. Not the control of a street corner or racecourse bookmaker, but the control of capital, of influence, and ultimately of the definitions, legal, social, and moral, that determine what kind of accumulation gets called enterprise and what kind gets called crime. The Peaky Blinders never achieved that level of control. The institutions that studied their model and refined it across the following century largely did. And understanding that progression is not an argument for cynicism. It is the prerequisite for seeing the financial world clearly enough to navigate it on your own terms. If this gave you a new way of seeing the line between criminal and corporate, and why that line has always been drawn by the people with the most to gain from where it falls, subscribe to Hidden Ledger. History is the only map we have, and the patterns it reveals keep repeating whether or not we are paying attention.